As I think about what we're going to be looking at here in Mark chapter 10, I cannot help but wonder if the human side of Jesus, because he's fully man, he's fully God while he's here on this earth, but just the humanity of Jesus, I wonder from time to time if he ever grew weary of having to repeat himself. If you've been blessed to be a parent, you know the drill. You know, as parents, sometimes we feel like we're repeating some of the same things over and over and over. If you're a school teacher, you understand the concept. If you lead people in the workplace, you sometimes wonder why you have to say the same things over and over and over. If you're a marketing person, you understand that an aspect of messaging is repetition. And I remember years ago, one of the leaders in our organization, he would say to us, we say it, and we say it, and we say it, and at the point that we are sick and tired of saying it, often our audience is just beginning to hear the message. And so you try not to grow weary of saying it. And so again, Jesus, as he's teaching and as he's ministering, I just wonder if he ever grew tired of having to repeat the same things over and over, and not to seekers, not to those who were assembling to hear him maybe for the very first time. But when you think about the apostles, when you think about the 12, they're on tour with him, they're traveling with him. And so you got to believe they hear a lot of the same sermons over and over. In fact, to the point that probably Jesus starts to tell a story and he says one line and they could probably jump up and repeat the next line in a lot of cases. And yet some of the things that Jesus needs them to understand, they don't seem to be getting. And so in Mark 10, our text today, from Jesus, we have repetition. For the third time to the 12, Jesus is going to say, hey, I'm going up to Jerusalem to die, to be murdered, and after 3 days, I'm going to rise again. He's going to say that for the third time. And then for the second time in this text, he's going to say, you only become great when you choose to be a servant, when you choose to serve. And today, Jesus is actually going to elevate that second teaching in a couple of ways, and we'll be talking about that today. And so let's look at this I'm going up to die message. Let's notice our text, Mark chapter 10, verse 32, beginning. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later, he'll rise again. Yeah, he goes third person there, which is kind of interesting. And so he paints this picture walking up, and Jerusalem, when you're going to Jerusalem, you're going up because it's up. And so he's walking on ahead. And so Mark uses a term, the 12, they're amazed. The NIV says astonished. The New Living says they're filled with awe. And that's a term that Mark often uses when he talks about the way people would react to Jesus. And so that's not too unusual. And, and maybe it's amazement to them because of the fact that somehow, some way it does kind of register, oh, Jesus has talked about being killed. And here he is just resolutely marching toward Jerusalem with purpose, no fear. That's amazing. Well, maybe that's what's going through their minds. But then Mark also talks about some folks being fearful. Now, as you read this, and depending on the translation you're reading from, there's great debate among scholars whether or not the original text is talking about the apostles being in amazement and being fearful, or whether the original text is talking about the apostles being amazed and other followers being fearful. Scholars are divided on this. The New Living has it depicted as two different groups. The New King James makes it out to be one group. The New American Standard that I'm reading from today, when you read it, it could be an either or, and it probably is. It's one of the most literal, and probably the reason they have it painted as an either or is because folks just aren't quite sure. Fear makes sense for the 12, because if Jesus has talked about being killed and he's on his way to Jerusalem, to the place that he said that's going to happen, and you're an insider, you may get swept right up in that, and so fear would make sense. But then for the larger group of folks that tended to follow after Jesus, fear also makes sense, because in Mark's gospel, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, it is depicted as a symbol of opposition to Jesus and his ministry. In other words, when you think often, it'll say, hey, the scribes, the Pharisees, those who are against Jesus, where did they come from? Where were they sent from? They came from Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem, it's a symbol of opposition. But in any case, when Jesus pulls the 12 aside for another moment of private teaching, this is his most detailed description yet of what's going to happen to him in Jerusalem. And the other thing to notice here is, as we enter this final week of Jesus' life, and that's, of course, what's being studied on Wednesday night here in the auditorium, but as we enter that, the pace of Mark's gospel, it's been rapid, it's been fast-paced, it's going to slow way down. You're not going to see the word immediately very often from this point forward. And so Jesus talks to them, but then he's also going to have to again talk to them about greatness done the wrong way, the way that they are trying to do it. And he's going to have to do that because of this inappropriate, strange request that comes from James and John. Notice verse 35. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized?" They said to him, "We're able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I'm baptized. But to sit on my right hand, or on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Now recall, a number of weeks ago, Mark chapter 9, they'd been in this discussion on the road about which of them was the greatest. The discussion occurred during a journey right after Jesus had talked about going up to Jerusalem to be murdered. But in this case, it seems more offensive. It seems more insensitive. It seems more inappropriate to the moment. Because in this case, it's almost as if James and John, and if you go over and read Matthew's account, Matthew reveals that they actually have Mama involved in this. They have Mama going to Jesus on their behalf. But they can barely wait for Jesus to get this teaching out of his mouth, and they're almost like interrupting with this request. And so while it is insensitive, if we think about the way we do life today, we probably sort of understand it. We probably sort of get it. We like being insiders. We like preferential treatment. It's nice to know that we have the ear of the leader of an organization, whether we're part of the organization or not. We like knowing that we've got the ear of somebody if we need it. And then beyond all of that, James and John, and of course Mama here, they're treating God in the flesh the way we often are guilty of treating God the Father in heaven when we pray. I mean, isn't that our prayer life in a lot of ways? God, as I pray to you today, as I get my to-do list for you ready, these are the things today that I want you to do for me. And we ought to think about this. In one sense, we are insiders with God. God, the creator of the universe, God wants us to be in his presence. He wants us to bring our cares and all of those things in front of him. We ought to be grateful that we are insiders in that sense. We ought to be grateful for that opportunity, that privilege every single day. And he's promised that we have his ear. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 12, and this is Peter quoting the psalmist in the New Testament. He says, "For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer." That's a promise, an inspired promise that God, we do have his ear. And he's provided promise after promise where he offers his blessing. He offers his help. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. "Therefore, because of the work Jesus as our high priest has accomplished, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." It's a further blessing to us that James would come along in his letter and would remind us of the importance of not putting requests in front of God for all the wrong reasons, not putting requests in God simply because there are things that we want to consume upon our own lust. James chapter 4, verse 3 talks about that. Because that's exactly what's going on here with God in the flesh, God the Son, Jesus during his ministry. Jesus, we've decided what we want, and so we're going to boldly come in front of you and ask you for what we want. We want to be your most important insiders. And of course, Jesus responds. It's a powerful statement followed by, just like with the rich young ruler, an important question. He first says, you don't understand what you're asking, and you don't understand the consequence of being a high-level insider in my kingdom. You don't understand the ramifications of that. Can you drink this cup? Can you endure the baptism of pain and suffering and even death that I'm about to endure? And of course, in their ignorance, James and John, and if you think in terms of Matthew's account, it's like Mama asked the question, and as soon as Mama asked the question and Jesus responds, it's James and John who say, yes, we're able, we're ready. And so Jesus says, hey, you will endure suffering, drinking the cup that I'm drinking, enduring the baptism of suffering that I'm about to endure. And history tells the tale. James would be the first apostle on record to die as a martyr for those, for the cause of Jesus. He would die at the hand of Herod Agrippa. We get that from Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And then we know John's story. John would be the only apostle on record to live to an old age, but he would end up on the Isle of Patmos, that rocky, deserted island. He would be banished there for a considerable amount of time. But another interesting thing happens here. Verse 41 of the text is important. Verse 41 ought to have our attention. Verse 41 of the text says this. It says, hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. One of the things we need to remember as we do life, both church life and all of life, is simply this. My public displays of selfishness, they don't just affect me. And they don't just affect, those that I'm closest to. They can have a far-reaching effect. And here, it's, James and John, they come with this request, and the 10 are like, what's going on over there? And then when they realize what has just been requested of Jesus, they're indignant, they're outraged, they're angry. And it seemingly points to the idea that among the 12, you've got a lack of cohesiveness maybe among the group. It underscores the idea that among the 12, you've got a competitive spirit among them. And it may well have been one of them, their anger in the moment, while they make it out to be about James and John, they may be angry with themselves as in, why didn't I think of asking that? Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I get to him first with that request? Because the evidence becomes clear. These guys, these leaders in Jesus' ministry, they're still jockeying for a position among themselves. And for us today, we've got to understand the negative that occurs when we as members of God's family get caught up in the contest that is jockeying for position within the Lord's body. Because if you think about it, this event in Jesus' ministry, so close to the cross, a week away from the cross or so, it's not a unifying moment. It's the complete opposite of selflessness. It's the complete opposite of servanthood. And I can't help but wonder if there is another group of followers there beyond the 12, what goes through their minds as followers of Jesus when they see Jesus' closest inner circle fighting among themselves over Jesus? I think of the old Oak Ridge Boys song. Some of you probably remember it. Nobody wants to play rhythm guitar behind Jesus. And the next line of the song is, everybody wants to be the lead singer in the band. And even though we see the problem that for what it is here in Scripture, it's easy to see that this is bad and this isn't good and this shouldn't happen. We've got to guard against getting caught up in things like this today. You know, it can play out in things like there's a ministry opportunity, a ministry need, and maybe my response is, well, that's not my job. Or maybe my response is, well, that's your job, or that's his job, or that's somebody else's job, or that's beneath me. And see, we'd never say that one out loud, but maybe our actions indicate that that's what's going on in our mind. Well, that's beneath me. Because almost always, and I'm thankful that I don't see a bunch of that here. If it goes on, it's so well concealed, I don't know about it. Thankfully, it doesn't happen much. But the danger of it is, if that begins to happen, if we ever get caught up in that kind of behavior, what typically happens is there is no outreach going on. There's no focus on getting Jesus' work done outside of these walls. And we never want to be part of any internal strife that would inhibit our ability to impact our community, to impact our state in a good way, to impact our world. We've got to always be thinking in terms of, as people come to look within, as people look in our windows at this church family here, okay, so they say they love Jesus. Does it look like they love Jesus? Does it look like they love His mission? Does it look like they love each other? Most of the world right now is united, in one sense, in regard to the fact that what Russian leadership is doing is just flat out wrong. Most of the world's united in that. The strange thing is, many in the world don't understand the reason that they intrinsically know that's wrong. And the reason many in the world intrinsically know that's wrong is because of the impact Christianity has had through the centuries on our world. A lot of people don't understand that. They don't understand why they know it's wrong, probably haven't thought about why they know it's wrong. We still have work to do. And we never want our own selfishness to be a barrier to getting God's work done. And so the next thing Jesus does is He begins to help them understand how they need to live. And so He first says it's not going to be the way the Gentiles do it. Notice verse 42. Calling them to Himself, He said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them, but it is not this way among you." The New Living says, rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. See, pagan rulers of the day, they were driven by the quest for power. Does that sound familiar? Self-promotion and self-preservation, they were problems in the first century. Those two things are still problems in the 21st century. People are still people. Some things never change. It's a blight today, even in our political process. Well-intentioned people, they're elected, and then they fall into that trap of self-preservation, and sometimes it prevents them from doing what's best, or sometimes even what's right. And so we understand how this works. And Jesus is simply saying, He points out, this is what happens in the world. And then He says to His guys, it is not this way among you. He says, you're acting like the world if you get caught up in that. Christianity, Christ-likeness, Jesus following, it's not about exercising control. It's not about exercising authority. And of course, it's no surprise that because we're still human, sometimes we still struggle with these things today. We struggle with the same kinds of issues. And we ought to be, I don't know if comforted is the right word, but if we can look at the 12, if we can look at the apostles, if we can look at the ones that Jesus chose to be his closest, the ones he would invest the most time in, if we can see them struggling with it, it shouldn't surprise us or shock us if we find ourselves struggling from time to time. Because it's easy to get caught up in wanting to be recognized as important. It's easy to be caught up in wanting our way no matter what the repercussions of that might be. It's easy to develop the belief that the people that we have authority over or think we have authority over are somehow there for us. And please understand, because of our mission, this isn't a church life versus work life or church life versus every other aspect sort of life thing. A Christian leader must strive to lead like Jesus would in every situation. And don't miss this, all of us are leaders in one way or another. And there's never a moment where we're awake that's not to be about us representing Christ to the very best of our ability. You remember what we're attempting to be and to portray to a lost and dying world. When we want people thinking about the Lord's church, we want them thinking about it being a fold of safety, a fold of peace. We want them thinking about it being a community of warmth and selflessness and love. We want folks to understand it's a place where people should want to be. It's a place where we want to be, that we look forward to being. It's a place where God is glorified, where needs are met. Our lives are to be about helping extend that offer on the behalf of Jesus to people that we come in contact with. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." But if we lead like the Gentiles, if we do life like the Gentiles, but then try to extend the offer of Jesus, we may never see the door open for some folks who need to be right with God. And so finally, Jesus gives them this, and this is where we finish up this morning. Again from verse 43, "But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." It's the same message that he's been attempting to drive home since back there in chapter 9, verse 35, except in this text, he elevates what he's saying in two different ways. First, he elevates the overall statement. He says in verse 43, you need to be a servant. The word there in the original, it's the word from which we would get something like minister, or the idea of ministering to others. We talk about, we want everybody in the church family to have a ministry. If you've not got a ministry, you need one. Everybody needs to minister and serve in some way. Same word he used in chapter 9, verse 35. But then notice what he does in verse 44. I don't know what your translation says, but the New American Standard, he says you must be willing to be a slave. Uses a different word in the original. That is the word that has to do with being in a servant sort of relationship, whether you want to be or not. In fact, he elevates it beyond that. He says, not only are you to take the mind of a slave, you are to have the mindset of being slave to all. Even a slave, whether that could be a paid servant who receives wages for serving the person that's hired them, it could be that, or it might be the idea of being owned by someone that most of the world has realized is not right and doesn't do anymore. Either of those, a slave was never going to be in the position of being owned by everyone. You'd hire on with one guy, one family, somebody owned you, but not everyone. But Jesus says, no, in my kingdom, you achieve greatness when you just go ahead and operate as if you're owned by everyone. Does that make you bristle any? It does me. I regard that as one of the hard teachings of Jesus, to wrap my willingness to listen to around. But he elevates the statement in a second way here in verse 45. And this is because he didn't do this back in chapter 9. In chapter 10, verse 45, after doing this and talking about being slave of all, he says, by the way, that's the way I'm doing it. You know, I'm not asking you to do something that I'm not doing myself. This is the way I'm doing it. Last week during the Lord's Supper, Jerry took us to John chapter 13 as we were thinking about Jesus' sacrifice and Jesus teaching his guys by showing them the necessity of being humble enough to embrace any need of the moment, even if it's the lowliest, most degrading, non-Jewish job that needed to be done, whatever it is, you get up and you do it. And then in John 13, verse 17, he concludes by stating that the blessing to be found is not in, oh, Jesus, he talked to us about that. He taught us about that. He said, no, it's not about knowing what I've taught you. It's about actually putting it into practice and doing it. Oh, and in that text, he also makes it very clear that the motivating factor for all of it, any ministry, when we allow ourselves to operate as slaves of all, he says it's got to be motivated by love. And so Jesus lived it. He's called us to live it as well. So how can we know if we've got the servant's heart? How can we know if we're developing this heart of Jesus? Well, what if we were more prone to ask two questions? And really, it's the same way of, you can ask the same question two different ways. But what if we were better at asking, what can I do to help? And I once heard a preacher say it this way, how can I loan me to you for your benefit? What if we ask those two questions more often? Because when we start asking those kinds of questions, and it's not always going to result in the easiest route, the path of least resistance, the most convenient route. It's not going to result in that. And the other blessing is, I know a lot of folks around here ask these kinds of questions all the time, and what a blessing that is. But what if we embrace that leadership and followership style when we go to work? What if we ask that question more at home? What if we ask that question more when we interact with our church family? Would we look more like Jesus? Would Jesus more easily be seen in us? Because what Jesus ended up doing was he served, he sacrificed all the way to the cross. Several weeks ago, when we were looking at Jesus attempting to teach this in Mark chapter 9, we went to Philippians 2, and we were reminded of the selflessness that it took for him to go to the cross. And when you think about it, everything, literally everything about our lives should be dealt with in terms of, run through the litmus test of what this means to my life in terms of the cross. And so selfish or selfless, when we choose to think selfishly rather than in terms of the impact of the cross, we end up with all the wrong ideas. And so as you examine your life today, do you see more selfishness or do you see more selflessness? Has selfishness on your part or even on someone else's, maybe you've been hurt by someone who is very selfish. Has selfishness somehow quenched the spiritual fire that ought to be burning within you? Are there relationships in your life that need to be fixed? Are you willing, if there is a relationship that's messed up, are you willing to take the first step toward reconciliation, even though it shouldn't be your job, even though it shouldn't be your responsibility, even though you ought not to have to take the first step to try to fix that because they hurt me first? All that garbage that we put out there. Slave of all thinking means recognizing someone might be lost in hell if things aren't resolved. And it doesn't matter that it shouldn't be my place to take the first step or shouldn't be your place to take the first step. See, I'd be interested to know what the discussions were among the 12 after Jesus laid all of this on them. I have to wonder if any of them in the moment made the choice to fix some things. Because it's always hard to put pride aside and say, I was wrong. But it is part of humility. It's part of selflessness. It's one of the things that Jesus never had to say, but it's one of the things that we must be willing to say. And so I would simply ask, do you need to respond to the Lord's invitation today? Thursday and Friday, we have an alumni lectureship at Heritage, and on Friday morning, my friend Joshua Pappas, as he was preaching about Jesus, he made a statement that really caught my attention. It's just come up on the screen now. He said, he, talking about Jesus, must be your everything, or you know nothing. When he first said that, it kind of created just a momentary train wreck in my mind, because I had to process on that. But the more I thought about it, he's exactly right. We can know a lot of things, but if Jesus isn't everything, and the fact that he's everything affects everything about my life, until that happens, I don't know anything. And so can you say that Jesus is your everything today? Have you demonstrated that by being immersed into Christ for the remission of your sins? Are you living that